Have you kissed any frogs lately? I know what some of you are thinking. What a strange title for a sermon. And oh my, what does it mean? Well, I'm not to blame that this got started. There's a fellow by the name of Wes Seeliger. He wrote a book called Faith at Work. I want to read just a little excerpt that'll kind of get us into this. He writes, "Ever feel like a frog? Frogs feel slow, low, ugly, puffy, drooped, pooped. I know, one told me. The frog feeling comes when you want to be bright and feel dumb. When you want to share but are selfish. When you want to be thankful but feel resentment. When you want to be great but are small. When you want to care but are indifferent. Yes, at one time or another, each of us has found himself on a lily pad floating down the river of life. Frightened and disgusted, we are too froggish to budge. Once upon a time, there was a frog, but he really wasn't a frog. He was a prince who looked and felt like a frog. A wicked witch had cast a spell on him. Only the kiss of a beautiful maiden could save him. But since when do cute chicks kiss frogs? So there he sat, unkissed prince in frog form, but miracles happened. One day, a beautiful maiden grabbed him up and gave him a big smack. Crash, boom, zap, there he was, a handsome prince. And you know the rest. They lived happily ever after. So what is the task of the church? To kiss frogs, of course. Jesus in the New Testament was the first frog kisser. We need to look at a little bit of the times in which the Jewish people lived in Palestine during the lifetime of Jesus. About 74, or a little less than 70 years before Jesus was born and was being raised by Joseph and Mary, the Romans had invaded Palestine. And they were a very cruel ruler. There was an early rebellion, and the Romans crucified over 120 men, and they left them hanging there on the cross along the roadways where people traveled, which left a very clear message. This was a time when people were extremely poor. Part of it was caused by the fact that those who had small parcels of land, because they were, under the circumstances, they were paying taxes both to the Romans and the temple, they could not pay off the debt that they had incurred. And so the land was taken away from them, and they became day laborers. And it is believed by many that Joseph, Jesus' earthly father, became a day laborer. Also, to be a Jew at this time, there were a lot of strict laws that you had to be obeyed, or you were not in connection with what the leaders wanted. not only were there strict laws about believing, which they were to practice in some way every day, but also they had strict laws about what you eat, what you don't eat, and what you do before you eat. They had strict laws about the sick and the dying. They had strict laws about almost every aspect of life. And it was difficult for people to keep up with this. The story of Jesus, most of us know the basics. That when he was about 30 years old, he went to the River Jordan in the wilderness, met his cousin John the Baptist, and was baptized. And later he started his ministry when John the Baptist was arrested and put in prison because he told Herod it's wrong to steal another man's wife. And Jesus made his home in Capernaum, which is a city by the Sea of Galilee. And he began to call men to be his disciples. Among the first four of them was Simon Peter and Andrew, who were fishermen working for their father. And then there was James and John, also fishermen working for their father. And he invited them to become his disciples. And he would continue to seek out men and invite them to become a disciple, which is a learner. Jesus was a frog kisser because when you read, particularly in the Gospel of Matthew and Mark, he did many unusual things. For an example, a leper came to him and knelt and said, "If you choose, you could make me clean." And Jesus reached out and touched him, which was forbidden, not so much by a law, but by safety, because everybody thought that leprosy was contagious. And he said to the man, "I choose that you be clean." And the man was clean of his leprosy. Jesus also did things that were really against by the common people. And one of the things that we notice in reading about these almost strange things that Jesus did was the fact that Jesus and all of the disciples were raised in a conventional culture. And that's a culture in which your parents, the elders of the community, teach you what is the correct way to live with all the ins and outs. And all of us here, anybody 18 or older, has been raised in a conventional culture. Jesus said when he, as you saw in some of the scripture, that it has been said, for an example, "You shall not murder. But I say unto you that you shall not swear against your brother, otherwise you'll be called into judgment." He also emphasized a whole different way of living. And you might call it an alternate way of living, an alternate kind of culture. And so, as you read the Gospels, you see where there are many instances where Jesus said, "You have heard it said, but I say unto you." And he healed, of course, a lot of people, but one time he healed a woman on the Sabbath and received a lot of negative reply from the elders because you don't work on the Sabbath. he had the experience of teaching in the synagogue in Capernaum, and there was a man there that had an unclean spirit, and Jesus told the spirit to leave this man. And of course, with much screaming and agitation, the spirit left the man. There are so many stories about Jesus healing people, and it's a way of describing it is to say he kissed frogs, because these people, with all of their troubles of health or mental problems or being ostracized by the society. For an example, another time, or many times, he ate with sinners. Now, when we think of a sinner, we think of somebody that's very immoral. You could become a sinner in the Jewish society because you didn't keep all the minute laws, which when you were of very low income, it was not able to do. Now, the times of Jesus and the time that he had was going about loving people, reach out to people with love, accepting people. It's interesting when you think about the 12 disciples. A lot of them had froggish qualities. 2 or 3 of the disciples had a very vile temper. Another one was a dreamer. Another one was a thief. Another one was a zealot. The zealots were wanting to find a way to kill as many Romans as they could. And Jesus loved them. He esteemed who they were and what they could become. And so I would hope we could understand that we are descendants spiritually of those first disciples. And what Jesus expected of them, he expects of us. Remember what he said to the disciples. Let me get a bit of water here. Throat's going dry. What happened after Jesus was risen from the dead, he met with his disciples both in Jerusalem and in Galilee. And the one scripture that was read from John about his questioning Peter whether he loved him happened in Galilee. But he let the disciples know that he loved them and that he thought enough of them that he commissioned them to go out into the world, the villages and the cities, and share the stories of how God had changed their lives through following the wisdom of Jesus rather than the wisdom of their own culture. I want to share with you one story. Jean Lair wrote a book. It says, "I ain't much, baby, but I'm all I've got." He was also a teacher in college, and he encouraged his students to accept people as they were. And he had a student named Sherry who did not believe in accepting people because she said that you can't trust them. But she said, for an experiment, since my teacher, Dr. Lair, has asked me, I'll do it as an experiment. Well, Sherry had a very grouchy neighbor. And she remembered that she had a birthday coming up the next Sunday. So Sherry baked her a cake. And feeling very foolish, she went over to her neighbor's apartment and rang the doorbell. And the doorbell, the neighbor opened the door and said, "Well, what do you want?" And Sherry simply handed her the cake and said, "Happy birthday." The lady turned white, and a very soft voice said, "Come in." And while they made that visit, Sherry learned why the woman was so grouchy. She and her family had made a pleasure trip to Michigan, and on that trip there was an auto accident. Her husband and 3 boys were killed, and the one daughter that she had was scarred very badly, probably could never be corrected. So Sherry learned that there was a reason for the lady being grouchy, and this was a transforming moment, because through that visit that afternoon, where she reached out in love, though she may not have understood all the particulars, but in spite of herself, she reached out in love, and out of that came a changed neighbor, a changed Sherry, because of the love. So as we think about our own lives and the call for us to be the disciples of Jesus, and as the message that Jesus left with his disciples was, "Love one another as I have loved you." So what Kissing a Frog is all about is reaching out in love to people that are acting or have problems that you could describe as being froggish. You know, they're disgruntled, they're upset, they're angry. Life has not treated them well. And I'm sure that in our paths that we travel during the week, out in the cities, shopping, at work, maybe even within our homes, there are people that need to be kissed because they're froggish, which means simply is to love them, accept them, because one of the things that is a necessary element for transformation to work is not to judge. The lady that Sherry had as a neighbor was feeling grief for her loss, but also she was feeling guilt because she was the lone survivor except for her daughter. So as we go out this week, I encourage you to find a frog and kiss it. And you may feel it'd be better to use other words, but that in a way describes it. So I pray a blessing on all of us today, that we will seek out the frogs, kiss them, turn them into princes and prince, and have transformation happening to them as well as ourselves. Amen.